Well, Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife, we're so excited to have you back. Thanks so much for joining us again.
Thanks for having me.
And we're so excited that you'll be here in person very soon for Restore. And you have a book coming out this year, which I feel like we've been talking about and thinking about for so long. And so the countdown is finally on, and we're just going to talk about a little portion of it today. And
Sure.
it feels like every single chapter could easily be its own episode. So I think this is a good way to start.
Mm-hmm.
I wondered if you would start actually where the book begins, which is just this little snippet of some conversations that you had with clients who you call Katie and Eric, because I think they set up a situation that you probably hear all the time. I think this is probably very familiar. And especially in the church and with all of the gifts that we have growing up in the church, but also with a little bit of the baggage, this is probably a dynamic that is pretty familiar. So I wondered if you could just start with their story and kind of explore this idea of duty versus desire when it comes to sex in a marriage.
So Katie and Eric, of course, is all pseudonyms. And these are a little bit amalgam stories because it is a story. I kept trying to think of new stories throughout, and I'm like, gosh, the stories are so similar.
Oh,
But
totally.
here's
Well, we have some friends named Katie and Eric, and I just assumed this was about them. So I'm glad you clarified that.
Exactly. Good assumption. Yeah. So basically, the story is where, Katie and Eric fall in love, feel lots of attraction, more than they even want to feel because they feel so alive and full of hope. And then for Eric, it's a second marriage. His first wife died. And Katie feels this clarity that she wants to be a solution in his life. There's a kind of security in the idea of being a bit of meaning she wanted to be needed. And she knew she could make a difference for his kids and for him. So she gives up her job and she moves across the country. And then she feels this kind of, upon getting married, just the desire plummets. And it's very confusing. And this is so many of my clients, like, why, when I could not keep my hands off him, do I feel no desire now? And so, the story begins with really Katie and Eric coming for help, confused because they're coming in sort of with a frequency problem. But what they really have is a desire and passion problem. There is this absence of this magnetic energy that made them feel so alive and so attracted and so hopeful that now is turned into sort of duty, obligation, and a kind of deadness in the marriage that they're maybe trying to address in the question of frequency, but it maybe expresses the problem, but it isn't the problem. The problem is the way that often in marriage, we strip ourselves down into something more predictable and contained, but we take the magnetic energy of Eros out of the marriage in the process. We do it unwittingly. We do it instinctively. And so I kind of show how both Eric and Katie are drawing on a lot of church narratives around what it means to be a husband and a wife, what it means to be a good partner, and how many of those narratives are really reinforcing the problem rather than challenging the problem. So, yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned in there I think you called it the magnetic energy of Eros. I know that you have a very specific and helpful meaning for that goes beyond just, I think the idea is, I think generally there's a sense that there's a mythological, god Eros that has something to do with sex. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, there's a lot of different philosophers that have talked about Eros in slightly different ways. But I think the best way to talk about it is this kind of, I think, divine longing that we have. It's a longing within the human soul to commune, to be in connection with one another, to be in connection with mystery, in connection with what we don't yet understand. It's the pursuing part of us. It's the part of us that doesn't just want to belong to our own reality and our own comfort. And when we fall in love, that Eros energy is really the defining energy. It's this, you see this other person, they're separate from you. You long to be closer to them. You long to be understood by them and to understand them. And it's also a part of even our theology, or what I would say is our longing to be in communion with God, with beauty, with divinity. And it's really something that offers our souls solace in a world that can feel uncertain and difficult. And so we're often looking for that life source or that life energy that Eros is. As a side note, a lot of people kind of conflate it with sex. And the word erotic, of course, the root of it is Eros. But erotic is to be in that life energy, and sex can be a powerful way to be in that life energy of communion and connection and pursuit. But of course, lots of sex has nothing to do with Eros. That is to say, being sexual doesn't put you in Eros energy. Or, as I've sometimes said, a red light district has zero Eros energy in it, okay, because it's futility and despair and so on. But our sexuality, our desire for one another is much more noble and lofty than sometimes we think of it as the lesser part of us, but I think it's a part of us that's very connected to our spirituality.
I remember it was right after we got married, we were taking when we used to do the marriage and family
where's
Sunday
the story,
school
where's
classes.
the story going?
Yeah.
The only thing I remember from that class was this warning that the honeymoon, what they called the honeymoon phase, wouldn't last. And I remember just the terror. Like I couldn't imagine what they meant by it, but it seemed really scary. And there was definitely this conviction around your relationship is going to change. And it's just the clock has started, and you're gonna lose this what I perceived they were saying was that you're gonna lose this Eros energy. You're gonna lose this feeling of infatuation and of like real connection that's flowing so freely. So and of course your relationship changes, and I have a lot of thoughts about what I wish that they had said instead.
Yeah, right.
But talk about that. Like what does healthy Eros energy look like in an older relationship where it's not really about newness and infatuation?
Yeah. So first of all, Eros is easy to have at the beginning of a relationship. And that's why some people chronically are getting into new relationships, because what happens is once that fades away or once it becomes more challenging, then it requires character development to keep it alive in a marriage. And so, the legitimate part of that beginning experience is, some philosopher described it as when a stranger becomes a soul. When you first meet that person, that you're drawn to them, you're attracted to them. There's something. I remember when I first met John, he showed up on the front porch of my new apartment when I was starting my master's program, and I just opened the door, and I don't think this is revisionist history. I remember just like immediately being like, hello, like who, like, I'm so glad you're here. Well, it turned out that he was dating my roommate. I'm like, oh, darn. But he came in, and I had this like literally a 10-minute conversation with him because she wasn't there yet. And I just had this immediate like draw, like there was something compelling about him. I wanted to understand him better. So that's legitimate. And there's even research that shows that there are certain people that will pull you in that way. And I don't know what exactly it is, but there was something both familiar and mysterious about him at the same time. So that's important. But I think what we often do in marriage is that we can project all kinds of things in that beginning stage, all the ways that we imagine they're going to come in and back up everything we desire. And in the beginning, when your brain is flooded with dopamine, you are projecting a lot of that. Everything they say is funny, and everything they think you consider. And, our biology is pushing us to get married and partnered. When you move into more of the reality, I talk about this a lot in my courses, is that we want two things in life. We want to belong to another person, right? We want to feel connected and cared about, but we also want to belong to ourselves. And therein lies the struggle, because it's like, look, I want to be with you, but stop telling me what to think, or start doing things the right way. You're screwing up my happiness. And so in that fundamental tension that's a part of love relationships lies the possibility of growing into somebody that can be true to themselves and make room for another person who is genuinely different than you. Right? Where our lesser selves, our egos, pressures the other person to conform, or we contort ourselves to be what the other will validate. But in the disingenuousness and the control, the Eros energy gets snuffed out.
Mm.
And so our ego wants safety and wants the sense that, I'm not going to take the risk of loving. So be more like me, or I'll be like you, just love me. But in that pressure, we snuff this divine energy that's asking us to grow into more whole, honest, authentic people capable of genuine love for another person.
So just to take a quick step back towards Aubrey's original question, are you making a distinction between what we might call infatuation, or sort of that dopamine flood in the initial stages of a relationship, and Eros energy? Specifically, and is the Eros energy then sort of like maybe something that's less easily definable scientifically? You can't just point to a specific hormone and say, there's the Eros,
Yeah. Well, I'm not really making a distinction because I
Okay.
think that is what's drawing us in, and there's a lot of power in that energy, and it's making us do things we wouldn't otherwise do. It's like, I want to know this person. I want to take the risk of asking them out. I want to take the risk of trying, right? So it is Eros. It's just in the beginning stages, and it's not asking us to address who we are at a more fundamental level. I sometimes say, when I'm teaching that marriage is a divine institution. Like I would say choosing and committing to another person has a pressure inherent to it that pushes us to mature.
Yeah.
And so I think to keep what's so fascinating and gratifying about the work that I do is watching couples come into crises within themselves and within their partnerships that are pushing them to wake up to themselves and to answer the question of if they're going to love. And am I going to make room for this person who's different than me? Am I going to address the ways that I am unloving or not caring for this other person? Am I going to address maybe how I've erased myself in this marriage in the name of love, but in fact has been bad for both of us? And so there's nothing like marriage, an intimate marriage, to be a real mirror on our own souls. And so we can either use that to be angry and a victim and, leave a marriage even if we never get a divorce, right? Or we can use that revelation to take a look at ourselves and to repent and to change and to mature and become more capable of a person that can celebrate and know another soul. And that's where Eros exists, right? It's in this, like, here I am with this person that I remember how I said, like, we want to belong to ourselves and we want to belong to another person. Well, in a happy marriage, you really have both. It's like, here I know this person so well. We've shared so much of our lives together. They know what I'm going to say in the next moment, in a sense, because we've mapped each other so much. And yet, this person I will never fully know. They are always a mystery to me. They're always separate from me. They've walked through the world in a different place, a different history, a different orientation to the world. And so I will always, there's a kind of longing that's always a part of a good marriage. It's like you long for them, but it's never gratified fully. And there's something in that longing that is life-giving, as we never are fully satisfied. I think even Adam Miller talks about this, that in love, you aren't satisfied. My thesis of my courses is like, look, a happy marriage is about what you do when you don't get what you want. That's what defines a happy marriage, rather than I'm going to get everything have control. And that's what our egos want. But when we go for all the control and the nailing down everything, we snuff out this life-giving energy of Eros that just asks us to tolerate the uncertainty, to love another person, to choose another person in marriage even, is to step into that uncertain energy.
Yeah.
I feel like there's such an interesting correlation in our relationship with God there.
Yeah.
Like when I was a young missionary, for example, and felt like, I knew the scriptures really well and I had the doctrine nailed down and I really understood who God was in really specific ways. That got stale, pretty quickly within a few years. And eventually, and I think people have probably picked up, bits and pieces of my story listening to this podcast, but, eventually it broke in a certain way. And eventually after that, God became much more mysterious to me
Yes.
again. And I was
Yes.
very much more uncertain about who God was and what my relationship with God
Yes.
was. And that actually led to an additional excitement where
Yes.
in the uncertainty and the mystery, like spirituality became much more interesting to me again.
Yes.
It became
Yes.
it became a pursuit,
Yes.
rather than an obligation.
Yeah, and this is just an adjacent idea, but I think there's also a choice in that element too. It's sort of like, look, I thought I knew you in marriage and God, I'm a little disappointed. I think when I went through some of my own disillusionment with God, it was like, are we even friends? Because I'm feeling
Yeah, yeah.
rather disappointed. Uh, but then there's a choice, like, can I kind of step back into the uncertainty? Can I still tolerate the exposure, in a sense, in desire and in longing,
Yeah.
whether that's in relationship to the divine, in relationship to another? And I think that's really at the core of what faith is. A lot of times we talk about faith like it's just believing in things that don't make any sense. But a lot of times that's more of a fear-driven thing. I'm just going to stop thinking about stuff that I can't nail down, as opposed to I can feel something, I can trust in something, in a process that's going to refine me, that's going to hurt. Um, and Yet I'm willing to subject myself to that for the sake of beauty, for the sake of love, for the sake of creating something
Mm.
stronger. And that's where Eros lives.
I love the way you very casually called this repenting. And because I still think of, I mean, we've talked about this endlessly, but there's still part of me who thinks of repenting as like getting back to where I was before. And I feel like the way you just used it was definitely this feeling of growing and expanding, and repenting is moving forward. And I know several people who've taken your course, like the couples one, and it feels like they're talking about the things they wanted to never talk about, and the things they've avoided for however long they've been married. And so I'm wondering if some sort of like, do you have to do this scary stuff to keep that Eros energy alive? Do you have to face the things that you'd rather keep put away? And is that part of this experience of Eros? Because when you describe Thanatos, or is that what it is?
Thanatos,
That's the experience that comes to mind. I feel death energy when I have to talk about something that is, I don't know, I'd rather die. Like, is that Thanatos?
Yeah.
But I believe you that maybe that's a step along the way. I don't know.
Yeah.
But would you talk about that? Because I know that that's an experience that people have, just opening up about the things that make them feel most vulnerable.
Yeah. So, yeah, I think you're right. It can feel like Thanatos when actually it's the birthplace. But, I'm not somebody who's like, you have to reveal everything at all times. I'm not saying that, right? But it is also like a lot of times what we're trying to do, we say we love the truth, but very few of us actually love the truth. I mean, who actually loves the truth? The truth can be so humiliating and so terrifying, right? And I remember my husband sometimes telling me things I'd be like, don't say it. Like, I don't want to hear that you think that, or that you see that in me, or whatever it is, right? And so, but you can't have a solid marriage, a marriage that's open-hearted and open-minded and freely flowing, if there is too much hiding in it, if there's too much dishonesty. And so what we intuitively do is we try to mask ourselves in marriage. I mean, you'd think that people that have committed to each other for eternity and are like, we're building our lives together, would more freely be open with one another. But in fact, they can often be more open with somebody on a ski lift than with their own partner, because they're so terrified of the stakes being so high. Like, if I really show you who I am, maybe you'll reject me. Maybe I won't be enough for you. Maybe we can't forge a life together in all of our difference. And so I want the control of a certain kind of masking or dishonesty or limited investment. And so, we can forgive ourselves for how intuitive that is, because it's scary business to be intimate. We sometimes think of intimacy as I'll tell you all the lesser parts of me, and then you validate them and say, I can understand that. And that's what we want intimacy to be. But really what intimacy is to know and be known. And that pressures us to grow up. That pressures our minds to evolve. And I think it's the Greek word of repentance is to change one's mind. right? So for the mind to, there's two different, one is like to reorient to the goal. And the other Greek word is to change one's mind, that one mind is evolving. And I actually like both definitions because I think they both are related to the process. But nothing grows us up than a bigger dose of truth than we currently accommodate. And I think marriage shows us ourselves and shows us, and if your partner doesn't do it for you, then your teenagers will. But there's just like a lot of opportunities to see ourselves more truthfully in relationships if we will let it. And if we can accommodate more truth, we evolve, we grow up, we become more capable of love, we become more godly. And so it's not an easy process, and repentance is fundamental to it. We talk about repentance often as if something went wrong, as opposed to it's just fundamental to the process. It's just what we're doing, hopefully. So yeah.
I love that. That's beautiful. So what do you do if you let's say you're listening and you feel like I wouldn't describe my marriage as having a life force. If it doesn't feel like you're living in this vitality that you're talking about, talk to people who feel like they want to find that again. Like what does it look like? How do you go from something that feels dead to something that feels very alive and something that creates joy in your life?
Well, sort of the spring, the source, I would say, is more honest connection, more intimate connection. And there are a couple of ways that people create more intimate connection. One of the things that, I offer a lot of different things, but one of the things that we do is we do these tours in Europe. And I know this isn't everybody that can do these, and we don't do them very often, but the thing that's so amazing about these experiences is that people are experiencing each other in different ways. Like they're learning how to dance together. They're doing something they both feel sort of awkward and they're laughing, but they're experiencing each other in these new ways. They're outside of their normal routine. They're outside of the taking care of the kids and so on. And so there's just something like reigniting about that, because this person that you kind of have in your back pocket, you're suddenly seeing them in they're joyful and they're experiencing something new with you. And so it reconnects you. But the other thing that's going on while we're on these retreats is I'm having people do some really hard things, like having some hard conversations that where they're looking more honestly at themselves and they're talking to their spouse more honestly about themselves in the relationship and about the relationship. And so it's bringing more truth onto the table. And that also pushes people to grow. I mean, nothing like the truth pushes you to grow. And so when they watch their spouse pick up that truth and say, you're right, that is true. I have been doing that and I'm sorry. And I know it's not been good. I know it's been hurtful to you. You see the desire and the attraction literally change right in front of my eyes. Like, it's just so amazing to watch people over several days like that. Or somebody that, will confront themselves and say, I haven't chosen you. I have been in the marriage, but I have not really stepped in, and I'm not going to do that to you anymore. And just not only does their partner get happier because they feel like, I've been feeling held hostage in a way in a marriage, but also the person making that courageous choice. I literally see a change in people's countenances. It's truly amazing because people start living more in line with what they know is true. And even though our fear will drive us to live in a kind of internal contradiction, our souls are longing for us to get aligned internally. Because when we do, we're more able to be joyful, we're more able to love, we're more able to be loved because we feel more worthy of that desire and love. So I'm really pushing people, the new experiences are wonderful when that can be a part of what's being offered. But the biggest thing I try to offer people is the opportunity to be more honest with themselves and more honest with their partner, because that is the source of growth.
Yeah. So I'm trying to map the sequence of events here. I imagine a lot of, couples who you work with they might be having some sort of dissatisfaction on either side, in their sex life, and they want to just like solve that. And they picture it as mostly just like going from bad bad sex life to good sex life. And in reality, it seems like what you're saying, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, because I'm trying to understand,
Sure.
is the first step is to sort of unlock more truth in the relationship through, vulnerability and honesty and repentance in the way you're using it, all of those things, which then it seems like will instantly sort of allow for an increase in this Eros energy.
Yeah.
And then the better sex life is a natural outgrowth of the
Yeah.
Eros energy. Am I
Yes.
mapping that
I think
correctly?
that's a fair way to talk about it, but it is also true that I'm often looking at what is happening or not happening in the sexual relationship
Mm.
to take a look at the souls in front of me. So do you see what I mean? So it's one of the things I resist a little bit is that sometimes we put it like the sex is the frosting on the cake, and so you have to and there's truth in
Right.
that, right? There
Yeah.
is truth in that, but because marriage is an erotic relationship, it is a relationship of choosing and desire, that what's happening in the sexual relationship is exposing the souls and exposing the relationship. And so that's also a fair entry point for me is looking, but it's not going to get solved by, hey, you just really need to do this. I'm not going into
Yeah.
the shoulds, but more looking at who are we as a couple? What are we doing here? What are we creating? What are we, what are we about? And the sexual relationship, as much as anything, can expose and show us that.
That makes sense. What do you do in the situation where I have to imagine this comes up all the time, where one partner seems to want to work on it in a variety of ways?
Yeah,
It could be the
for sure.
more direct sex approach, and it could be the more sort of indirect, truth and energy
Yeah,
approach, and the other is not really interested in doing this. How do you
sure.
handle situations like that?
Well, so for one thing, I mean, if a couple comes to me and one is getting dragged in,
Yeah.
I always start with the one that's sitting there all eager and they're like, I've listened to everything you because they're the most workable. And I need to kind of earn their spouse's trust in a way that I'm not here to fix the impaired one, because oftentimes
Yeah.
that's why they're resistant, is because they believe that they're being seen as the problem. And there may
Yeah.
be truth in that, but nobody wants their spouse and a therapist to gang up on the impaired one. And
Yeah.
so it's a way of balancing the alliance, because there's often good reason why the lower desire person, for example, for working on the relationship, or lower desire for the sexual relationship, there's usually good reasons. There's usually some legitimate things going on there that make their behavior make sense. And so I think of couples as sort of operating more in a system than two individuals who happen to have individual characteristics. So I'm often trying to, this is maybe a little more theoretical than you want to get it, but I'm trying to kind of basically change the systemic reality. And I can do that by talking to the higher desire person or the lower desire person for dealing with the relationship. But it is also true sometimes that I'm working with people where there's one person, it's not about that they fear that their spouse has a stronger alliance with me, or they really just don't want to deal with the marriage. They don't want to choose it. They don't want to deal with the sexuality of it. And they certainly don't want a therapist in there, trying to tweak it. But then I'm going to do my best to bring more truth to this couple. Not because I don't actually even think of my job as making couples stay together or even helping them have, how to say it? My job is not to get people to have better sex. My job is to help people see themselves and their relationship more truthfully so that they can make choices out of integrity, so that they can make choices out of the best in themselves. And so if somebody's partnered with someone who has no interest in an intimate marriage, has no interest in working on it, I'm going to name that that's what I see. Not because that person should want it or is a bad person, but more maybe waking up the marriage to the fact that you're trying to convince your spouse to want something that they don't want. And as long as you're in pursuit of trying to get them to want something, they don't have to deal with the onus of their own decisions. And so I'm at least waking people up to that, because when we're doing anything more than what is actually our job in a relationship, I know this sounds very unromantic, we're actually interfering with the intimacy of it. And
Say that one more time.
Yeah,
Wait.
when we're doing more than what is actually our job in a marriage, So I
Yeah.
often talk about being collaborative is doing 100% what is your responsibility, but 0% of what isn't your responsibility. Because if you go in and do what is someone else's, you're actually interfering with them. You're actually doing something that works against the marriage.
Yeah.
So if you're constantly trying to get your spouse to want you, get your spouse to choose you, not only are you not dealing with the fact that your spouse has a choice and learning how to stabilize yourself in the fact that you may not be chosen in this marriage, you're so busy trying to convince them that they don't have to, they can almost justifiably resist all your pressure rather than dealing with the question of who they are and what's happening in the marriage and how they're a part of the problem. So it's helping people to get more aligned around what their choices are and how they're impacting the marriage.
Yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So two questions for you then. How much of Eros energy is dependent on being partnered? Like, is this something that can be flowing in your life because of a choice that you're making,
Yeah.
and it really can be independent in some ways from a partner, whether that is because you are not partnered or because your partner is not
Yeah.
interested.
Yeah, yeah.
And also, well, go there first, and then I have one more
Okay.
question
Sure,
for you.
sure. So yes, I would say, and this is not something I've written about, so my thoughts on this are a little unclear still, but I would say, yeah, absolutely. Eros is a way of living, right? It's a way of being in relationship to life. It's
Okay.
to celebrate life. It is to love being alive. That's what Eros energy is. It's to make love to the world, in a sense, in your heart, that you're grateful every day for the beautiful world you get to live in. Even with all the adversity and difficulty, that you can celebrate what is joyful and good in it. So it's a way of being in existence. And, I last year at Faith Matters, I talked about Eros and the light of Christ and how these two were very related. And I gave the example of my mom. She was very much someone who lived her life in that Eros energy even after my dad passed away. So she just kept leaning into life and embracing it. So it is independent in that sense of how we're in relationship to ourselves, to the world, to our physical selves. And I do think it's probably also true that there's a level in which in intimate relationship, you can experience a different level of communion, perhaps, I suppose. But I think it's very much about just how we orient to life in general.
Okay. Yeah, and I love that you talk about that, because I know those people. Like, they're really, it's really an energy you can feel, that they
Yeah.
just seem to be fully alive, just bursting with something that feels like energy and
Yes.
is really about their own soul. So I appreciate
Yeah.
that you are pointing that out. I just want to one more thing. If we go back to this example of Katie and Eric, because when you talk about, doing your job 100%, I want to make sure to differentiate doing your job versus,
Mm-hmm.
following some sort of role that you have in your mind that really contorts the way you show up in a relationship into this sort of like duty, soulless,
Yes.
soul-sucking
Yes.
experience of checking boxes and being a good wife or
Yeah.
a good whatever in a relationship. Because it feels like what you're saying with the Katie and Eric example is that this feeling of just like totally reflexive self-denial has so
Yes.
much to do with what suffocates her
That's right.
what would be desire.
That's
So
right.
can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. So when Katie came to me, she actually came like, I've got a problem. I need to be a better wife. So she was very much doing it in the
Wow.
should frame, right? I need to figure out how to hate this less.
Wow.
And she actually even said to me, because she came to me first, if I never had to have sex again, that would be completely fine with me. Now, what she didn't see is that, first of all, it made sense that she felt this way because it was 100% in the should frame. And she came by this honestly, right? This whole idea, like, always give your husband the sex he needs. Otherwise he'll be, this is the kind of advice that she got. She had a mother that did this kind of martyr, long suffering thing. So she intuitively framed it in this martyr, long suffering, which just made it feel like 100% Thanatos. Like, you know what I mean? Like it's one thing to do things dutifully, but like to do it with your body, it's just really brutal. I think it's very, very hard thing to do. What I think she didn't fully understand or see in herself was how much she was depending on her husband to desire her. That gave her the safety to not desire and not be exposed because there's a validation in him being in pursuit of her. So I didn't see this at first either. They started working with me together. She'd never had an orgasm. She'd never had pleasure in sex. And so I start giving them, this is when I was relatively new in my work, and I started giving them exercises and nothing worked. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. And I don't think she was like trying to have it not work, but she was internally in contradiction. He's trying to get her. So going back to this, making one's responsibility, she's trying to manage him not being disappointed in her by producing sexual desire. He's trying to get her to want something she doesn't want. So they're both taking on each other's responsibilities in a way that's killing Eros. What finally happens is when nothing's working, he finally comes to a place in himself that had more integrity in it. And he says, he comes to a session and says, I love you, I care about you, but I don't want I don't want to pressure you to want something that you don't want. And I'm not going to go anywhere. We'll raise the kids together. When the kids are gone, I may well make another choice, but I don't want to try to make this be something that it isn't. So I'm willing to take no as an answer. And this was him taking onto himself, like, I have two choices. Well, he could leave the marriage, but if he's going to be in the marriage, he has two choices, which is I'm either going to keep, pushing her to accommodate me, and I always feel sort of humiliated by it, or I let that part of the relationship go. And I think he came to a place where he felt the most at peace with not trying to make it something it wasn't and making a integrity-based choice. So I thought, because I was new at this, I thought she was going to be like, oh my gosh, thank you. Yes. Okay. Like finally. And she was not at all. She was like, what do you mean? And she could suddenly see that she was depending on him to be circling around her, waiting. That gave her a reassurance without the exposure. Mm-hmm. And so in him getting more aligned within himself, it was exposing to herself who she was. And she was like, I'm being a martyr. I'm being like my mom was. I don't like who I am. I would not, we talked through all this, but she's like, I would not like it if my son grew up and married somebody like me, because I would not respect what she was doing. And so it was like exposing the lack of integrity in her own position. And so then she was like, a couple sessions later, she just came back and said, I really want this marriage. And I want it to be an intimate marriage. And I don't want you to not desire me anymore. And then everything changed, because now she was like wanting to figure out how to have an orgasm, because she wanted to figure out her sexuality. She wanted to be, she was putting herself into the marriage. And so she did. She did like within a week. So it was, everything really changed because she wasn't in an internal contradiction within herself, which a lot of low desire people are for good reasons, because they don't want to just produce pleasure. It has to come from something inside of us for it to truly be Eros. It has to come from our desire to create something, to, love someone, to choose them. And that has to come not from should, but from desire.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. I think, to me, one of the most interesting parts about your work, Jennifer, is that you do work, I think you say it in the book, almost exclusively with Latter-day Saints. And our tradition is so embodied, and so sexual in some ways. The religious tradition begins, or the modern version of it at least, with these embodied beings appearing to Joseph Smith, and we imagine in the future that we're going to be potentially populating worlds, and I think implicitly, we don't talk about this too much, but implicitly there's some sexuality involved somehow in that process. And so given that fact, it could be seen as surprising that many Latter-day Saints and Latter-day Saint couples struggle with their sexuality, accepting themselves as sexual beings, and being in sexual relationships. So how do you think about that disconnect? What has caused it, and how does a Latter-day Saint in general, move toward this sort of like healthy sexual acceptance of themselves?
Yeah. So it's surprising, and yet it isn't surprising. And it isn't only Latter-day Saints that struggle with sexuality. I mean, we want the idea that if we just didn't have these repressive mores, we would all be having fantastic sexual relationships. And that's just not true. I mean, believe me, my colleagues who are working with non-Latter-day Saints are confronting very similar kinds of challenges because intimacy is a tough business. I mean, it's one thing to have sex, but it's another thing to be intimate with another person sexually. And most of us struggle with that because it's dependent on our own ability to be at peace with ourselves. And so how do we grow into a deeper peace with ourselves? The other thing, kind of a backbone of my book, is I talk about 3 stages of development. And most of humanity doesn't develop to the highest stage. And in the highest stage is when we become most capable of choosing and desiring and having intimacy with another person. When we're younger in our development, where we all start and where, most of us reside, is much more fear-based, much more rule-based. And so we have an LDS version of it, but it's more around fear and control, which are very human inclinations. And so when we bring that to sexuality, we make it harder to integrate our sexuality and to be able to love through it. And so, so much of my book is trying to help us see the ways that we, out of, an understandable fear and understandable desire for control, how we interfere with the very thing that we want, which is this life-giving Eros. And so, I'm using the best in our theology to show how we can grow into this, how we can offer a better model to our children about how they can grow developmentally through their sexuality to become capable of sexual intimacy. But it is a process, and it is a process that takes our integrity and our honesty and our willingness to grow ourselves up. And so I think the idea that, we have an unhealthy model and we just need to get more healthy is just too simple of an idea and not really pointing to the kind of moral work that's behind becoming capable of intimate love of another person.
Are there ways, though, that, I'm thinking of scriptures like, let virtue garnish thy thoughts unceasingly. And the way I interpreted that as a teen was like, if you have a thought, like a spontaneous thought, you just it's like all hands on deck, like emergency, shut it down as fast as you can. And I think that probably has something to do with this impulse we have towards self-denial. And so is there a way, are there small adjustments that you'd like to see us make that maybe would go a long way in not painting sexuality as
for sure
a broken part of ourselves?
I put a line in the book that I ended up taking out because I just thought it'll get people.
Oh, yay! What?
But it was something like this woman that how she's progressing. She let herself start thinking sexually, right? And I said something like, and she garnished those sexual thoughts unceasingly, right? She really let herself have them. Okay. So going back to this, absolutely, this is a problem. When we make sexual feeling and thought a problem, we are interfering with a process that we need. We need to be able to tolerate the fact that we are sexual beings and we're going to have thoughts and feelings, and sometimes at very inconvenient times. And that's just normal human reality. And if we turn that into that makes us bad, that makes us evil, that actually makes it more, that interferes with integration of sexuality. So that is, it interferes with the humans that do the best, right? They know they're going to sometimes have antisocial thoughts even. They're going to think things that's probably not the best thing to think. But the people that do the best are able to kind of tolerate that they had the thought and then direct their thought towards something that they can back up, that they can feel better about. It's also true with sexuality. It's like, or any passion, yes, I want to eat more cake, but, I also have this other goal that I want to be healthy. So it's not that you berate yourself for wanting the sensual thing. It's you think about what is it that I ultimately want. And the more you can accept yourself as a sensual embodied being who's going to have a lot of different kinds of desires, the more able you are to kind of point yourself to your higher desires and think about how do I integrate these feelings and impulses towards that larger goal and that larger aim. That's desire based, not shame based. When we do it in a fear based way, in a shaming way, we actually interfere because we have to do a kind of self rejection that interferes with developing this deeper peace with ourselves, a deeper self-trust, a deeper ability to direct our own actions in the face of erratic feelings. So it's
So
not a
Makes
helpful
sense.
message. Yeah.
Yeah.
that makes sense. I want to dig in just a little bit on what you said there. I see the world often through the lens of OCD because that's part of my journey, and I can very much relate with wanting to, like, having a thought of various kinds. It could be an antisocial thought or a sexual thought or whatever, and wanting to redirect it, somewhere to my higher self. Like, that's the deepest desire of my heart, and because it is so deep, I cannot seem to do it. Um,
Mm.
it seems like often when you care so much about being sort of like pure and righteous,
Yeah.
that's what causes the rumination,
Yeah.
and these thoughts to like just spin
Yeah.
and not be able to let go of them. So could you talk to our listeners, diagnosed
Yeah.
or undiagnosed with
Yeah. Yeah.
OCD? Like what is the actual mechanism where you could handle a thought like that in a healthy way?
Well, I'm not necessarily an OCD specialist, but what I would say
I
is
sure.
the more you can tolerate just the presence of it. Because I think, so while I'm
Yes.
talking about like a non-OCD person, you're like, you remind yourself of where you're headed and so on. But what the person that doesn't struggle with OCD is maybe more able to do is just like, no, like I'm going to have that thought and that's okay. Like it's not going to
Yeah.
control me. It's not going to define me. Of course I'm going to have it. I can even laugh at the fact that I have it. I can even make jokes about the fact that I have it because I know that ultimately it doesn't define me. And
Yeah.
and so I'm imagining in the OCD mind, it's like this is not supposed to be here. This is scary that it's here. I've got to get to this higher self. And I would say probably the fastest way to the higher self is to tolerate the lower self is going to show up
Yeah.
and stick around sometimes more than you want.
Yeah.
Wow.
What you said there seems really key to me. Like, I think people without OCD are able to recognize that the thought does not define them. My worry when I was really struggling with this was that the thoughts that I had did define me. So I have the sexual thought. What does that mean about me as
Yeah.
a person and as an eternal being? I have an
Right.
antisocial thought. What does that mean about my identity?
Right.
And there was a key change in mindset for me when I finally got diagnosed and treated, where counterintuitively I had to accept the possibility that the
Right.
thought did mean something about my identity. Like, I
Interesting.
was
Oh, wow.
so obsessed with proving to myself
Yeah.
that it
Yeah.
didn't mean something about my identity, that war just waged
That's right.
on,
Wow.
and there was no getting rid of it. And when I was able to say,
Yeah.
I'm worried that that means X about me,
Right.
maybe that's the case, then it's sort
Wow.
of like OCD, but I was saying, and so
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
no.
I love that. I'm so glad you're here to voice that piece because exactly, instead of like trying to rationally say, no, that doesn't mean anything about me. The OCD
Yeah.
brain's like, oh yeah, I mean it. So you have to
Mhm.
almost go with it and be like, well, maybe it does. Maybe I really do
Yes.
want to
Yeah.
kill people, you know?
Yeah,
And
yeah,
then almost,
exactly.
Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
somehow it loses its power. Yeah, I love that.
Yes.
Yes, it's that acceptance of uncertainty. The OCD
Yeah,
brain, I think,
yeah.
wants certainty about itself and about it, like about oneself more than anything else.
Oh yeah.
And just not feeding it that certainty seems to lose its power.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
really, really good. Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you both. That kind of like even deeper level of acceptance feels so empowering. I'm remembering, Tim, we did so many years ago, I don't know, 17 years ago. There was this book called A Complaint-Free World. It was a great book. It was all about positivity and not complaining. I don't remember, but you had to wear this bracelet, and every time you complained or said anything negative, you were supposed to switch the bracelet. And it became this, I mean, it was like it illuminated all the things that you would like to complain about because we were so obsessed with not thinking the complaint. I think I did it for 8 months before I finally made it. You're supposed to do it like 21 days or something without speaking a complaint out loud. But I think what it reiterated to me is that I was choosing to think about my complaints more because I was
Exactly.
trying so hard not to think
Not to
about
have
them.
them. Yeah,
Yes.
exactly. It's the
Yes.
hardest thing. It's like, don't think about sex or don't. And then
Yeah.
it's like,
Yes.
like that's all I think about. Or,
Yeah.
You talk about this somewhat in chapter 1, I think, where you say that repression leads to obsession in some
Yes.
cases, and this gets into like pornography use and other things. Do you want to talk about that a little bit specifically
Yeah,
with
it's
sexuality?
just the same. Exactly. It's where we work against our own goals often in our, rather than kind of culturally holding on to this larger aim of what our theology can actually offer to us, this ability to embrace the body, embrace sexuality, to think of ourselves not in this perfectionistic, every time I sin, I'm causing Christ more suffering. All of that is very stage one thinking about humanity. I mean, look, we all do it, but it's like, it's not a helpful idea. Rather than we're here to develop, we're here to grow. Mistakes are just part of the process. There's no other way to do it. You just plan on it. You're going to be making mistakes. The reason we have commandments and guidelines is because the more we can learn from others' mistakes, the less it hurts. But you're still going to be making mistakes because there's no other way to grow into a being capable of love and intimacy and care. And that our embodiment is not only, part of this, it's like fundamental to it. I'm finishing up the last chapter right now, which I'm writing so much about how the body is this instrument of perception, that it's a gift and so fundamental to our spirituality and to the capacity for joy. So, like, if we can hold on to that better, we could be less obsessive when one of the critiques, I have a chapter at the very end about how to talk to our kids about sex, but when we pathologize normal sexual development, we're really, really being cruel to our kids and to ourselves, because we're basically making the feelings, the sexual feelings that are fully coming on board for most 12 and 13-year-old boys, right? We're making that like somehow Satan has gotten their heart, as opposed to no, they're growing into sexual beings, and it's going to feel really unruly at first, and you're not going to even recognize yourself. I mean, think how the low point of my life was age 12 and 13. Okay? Like, your body's changing. You don't, you have acne and, and then this sort of peer references come on board. And so then to start hearing messages that these feelings you're having are about you sinning drives this division between the, the soul, the psyche and the soul of that person. And it really creates either repression, like, oh, I'm just forget this whole project. I'm just not going to have any thoughts and I'm going to be so virtuous and good. Or this kind of obsession where you're like trying so hard not to have the thought, trying so hard not to masturbate, that you're thinking about it all the time, that the whole sacrament meeting is thinking about sex because you're trying to repent of all the feelings you're not supposed to be having, rather than just normalizing that, yeah, you're going to have sexual thoughts, you're going to have sexual feelings. That means that you're growing into an adult and learning how to respond to those feelings wisely, learning how to accept them as part of the human condition, but you need to learn how to direct them. To, bridle. We usually think of bridling as like suffocating rather than like a horse. So you're directing those feelings towards what you actually want to create in your life. And so the more we can teach it as this beautiful part of being a human being, or it can be, but you have to learn, you have to learn, if you just let a horse go wherever it wants, it's not going to, or a fire, it can be destructive. But learning how to channel that energy, well, then it can be a source of warmth and light and beauty and goodness. And so there's something to control, but not out of fear and trying to snuff it out, but direct it and cultivate it and allow it to create goodness in your life.
Wow. Thank you so much. Maybe to wrap up, I know we need to wrap up, but could you just talk about how, like what you would like to see people do to sort of open up this Eros energy wherever they are? What does bridling look like if my intent is actually to increase the flow of Eros energy? And how can we do that in whatever situation we find ourselves in our life? I know you talked about just experiencing newness in partnership.
Yeah, novelty and stepping into uncertainty is all part of the Eros source. So and our bodies are very much a part of it. So, learning to dance, climbing a mountain, but trying new things tolerating the risk of trying new things, you're going to tap into more Eros energy because it's what makes you feel alive.
Yeah.
The opposite of Eros is Thanatos or depression, recoiling, fear, pulling into yourself. And there's a time and place for recoiling, of course. But where are areas that I've been afraid to step out, afraid to take a risk, afraid to grow, but my soul is calling me towards it, right? Am I avoiding that because I think it's poor judgment? Okay, that's fine. But am I avoiding something just because I'm afraid, because I don't want the exposure and the risk in it? Well, then you're denying that Eros call.
Wow.
And so stepping in more deeply. And if you're partnered, stepping more deeply into your marriage in a more honest way, tolerating more exposure of your soul, of who you are, of what you desire, of letting the other person know you. It will spark more turmoil at first, but more energy. You've got more energy
Yes.
now to address the marriage and to create something that's got more integrity in it. And what I mean is it's more deeply aligned and kind of anchored into what's true. So it's daring to, it's having enough faith in life to take risks, to live it with your whole heart.
Thanks
Thanks,
so much,
Jennifer. I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you. You know how important we think your work is. We're super excited about this book, and we're excited to see you at Restore in a few weeks here.
Yeah, I can't wait. It'll be great.
Yeah. Thanks, Jennifer.
All right, thanks so much for listening. We really hope that you enjoyed this conversation with Dr. Jennifer Finlayson-Fife. She'll be joining us this year at Restore, so if you'd like to see her live, you can get your tickets at faithmatters.org/restore, and we'll see you on September 5th through 7th at the Mountain America Expo Center in Sandy, Utah. And remember, you can check out more at faithmatters.org.